Dr. Arun Vishwanath is among the foremost experts on the people problems of cybersecurity. His research on the science of cybersecurity focuses on the largest surface of vulnerability in enterprise security users. His body of work includes the development of methodologies to quantify human cyber risk, approaches to diagnose how and why people are at risk through social engineering, and techniques to mitigate this risk. Arun is an alumnus of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University and has held faculty positions at the University at Buffalo and Indiana University. He has co-authored close to 50 peer-reviewed research papers on the science of security and has written pieces for CNN, The Washington Post, Scientific American, and other leading media. His views on cybersecurity have also appeared in Wired magazine and in reports such as the 2019 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, DBIR. And now, I am going to let Arun speak.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, and everyone. It's great to be in this forum. Thank you for spending your virtual time with me. I've done quite a bit of academic work in phishing. I started doing this very early, and when I say early, 2008, 2009 is when I started working in this area from an academic point of view. I kind of stumbled into it because the university that I was at had an attack that everybody ignored, but it kind of fell in line with something I was doing with users in technology. So I was studying how you could make users of just general software do things differently by framing things differently and so on. And that started a saga of a lot of work that I started doing over the years, much of which was ignored. Okay, so one of the things for all of us academics here is, the thing about academic writing is that academics write to other academics, and other academic writers seldom read other academics unless it's something that, they're trying to improve or better or what have you. So a lot of this stayed within academia, and over the years it became more and more popular and more interesting. But back when I was doing this, I would go to conferences and I'd be the only one speaking about a topic in a room full of just basically 2-3 people. So part of what I tried to do was now, create a bigger impact of my work. And I started writing about it in the media, when Sony Pictures happened, I wrote on CNN, because again, at this time in 2013, I had quite a mature research program on understanding social engineering, simulating different types of attacks. And I was tracking many attacks like Dark Soul, which had happened way before Sony back in South Korea. And one of the things I noticed right away was, much of the media was ignoring what really was going on and what was happening and what was about to come. And I kept writing in the media, warning policymakers of what was coming. I was talking about infrastructure attacks before we had infrastructure attacks. I was talking about ransomware before we had ransomware, and on and on and on. And I keep writing. Part of what has happened is that it hasn't ended. There seems to be more happening, and there seems to be less real action that changes the paradigms that we have. And we're going to talk about some of those paradigms today. Fast forward to 2023, and spear-phishing still remains a very important vector. Right? I don't have to tell people in this audience that it is a very important vector, and it remains a primary vector when it comes to things like initial compromise and even other things. And when we look at the data points, this is a 5-year complaint statistics from IC3. Again, this is a global security losses due to online attacks of all forms. And we're talking about, $18 billion of cumulative losses over the years. Every statistic we look at, spear-phishing still comes on top, right? There's different kinds of vishing, phishing, farming, whatever they may be, different forms of social engineering that make a huge impact. And even things like identity theft, extortion, all of these have an element of social engineering of some form involved in it. So, almost $2.4 billion is just BEC as of 2021. So these numbers tell us about what's really going on out there and how little an impact what we have done so far, be it in academic circles, be it in policymaking, be it in industry, has actually made. The difference that we've made is quite marginal compared to the volume of attacks that keep growing. And it's hard to not think of this continuing, right? You don't have to be, super smart to realize that, hey, none of this is going to change. It's in fact going to get worse because the number of players, the payoff from spear-phishing today is humongous, right? Just last year we heard about some young couple, Heather Morgan. She's a rapper, a white rapper from New York City, who basically stole billions of dollars from Bitfinex, in a sense, using social engineering, right? We heard about young teens who seem to be at the forefront of social engineering and various groups, that hacked into Microsoft, NVIDIA, Samsung, LG, T-Mobile, Okta, name them, and these companies have been hacked. And don't forget that these are companies also on the forefront of technology, like Microsoft and T-Mobile and Samsung. And there's a ton of money to be made. Right? There was a Nigerian guy who, last year got indicted because this guy made millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, basically using social engineering, essentially a Nigerian scammer. And he flaunted it. He had jets. I've never been on a private jet yet, but he has, and he was living the big life, right? There are people stealing for all kinds of reasons because it's easy to do social engineering and because we haven't essentially gotten to stopping it. Right? Last year, a person in Italy was basically stealing books from authors before they went to print. So he had a leg up on how or what books were coming into the market. What was he doing? Social engineering. And on and on and on it goes, right? It hasn't stopped. And if there are academics out there reading our articles, 3 Iranian nationals were charged with stealing 30 terabytes of academic data and intellectual property. So when I started by saying, a lot of academics don't read other academics' work, I always think of some Iranian guys out there with 30 terabytes of all our data basically reading it. Because some poor guy out there has to actually read it because they have access to it. So spear-phishing, pretexting, wishing, phishing, farming, social engineering, if you want to use that larger framework of it, is out there. It's growing. It has grown. We haven't been able to stop it. And it's not about to stop. And the central target for every one of these actors, be they state-sponsored actors, be they individual actors, be they hacking groups, whoever they are, maybe terrorist organizations out there, is the user, right? The user remains the focal point and the weakest link. And that's essentially the topic of my book, right? The weakest link. And they remain the weakest link because we have a cybersecurity paradigm that we have applied to basically protect people in a certain way. And we're going to talk a little bit about the flaws in this paradigm, but let's look at what this paradigm really involves, right? So the paradigm involves what I like to call as the 4 C's, right? The 4 C's is one is you constrain people, right? You constrain access through some kind of, privilege restriction. The other C is you contain, right? You contain it through firewalls. You contain access through whitelisting, intrusion detection. Back in the day, you remember there was EMET. Two-factor authentication is a way of containing to some extent or restricting access. So these are your various containment options. So you can either constrain, you can either contain, or the last thing that people do is we convince, right? A lot of money is spent convincing people. And this convincing of people is something which the human factors people focus on quite a bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about this and how this convincing happens. But to understand what containment and constraining really does, in terms of cybersecurity cost, it's an arms race out there where there are billions of dollars spent, right? Each year, except for the pandemic years, these numbers tell you that globally we're spending about $60 billion on cybersecurity worldwide. And the lion's share of this goes to containing and constraining. But the cost when it comes to, when you think about the containment costs that are going on out there, the constant idea is that if we just build enough technology protections, things will be saved. But for every technology protection that's out there, there's always a story that's sent to me. And I have people from all over the world sending me stories and anecdotes of ways in which people, evade and overcome technological hurdles. So here's a story I got from someone from India who was talking about fingerprint surgery. There were about 500 people who got fingerprint surgery to basically, evade fingerprinting to get visas to get into a different country. So every time we think that, we have Touch ID, there is a mechanism or a group of people out there trying to figure out a way around it. There was another story that someone sent to me about a person, there's this talk about using human DNAs as fingerprints. And then there was this case of a person who got a bone marrow transplant and basically had 2 different DNAs in him. And then there was this story, I don't know if any of you caught this last year, of basically a scam where people were lured, hundreds of people, into Cambodia to basically work as a social media, social engineering sweatshop. So their job, they were called in for employment, taken to Cambodia, kept under lock and key, and basically made to create fake profiles on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and attack and hack targets. So this was like a phishing sweatshop. So in this arms race, the user focus is quite important. And when we look at the cost of what's happening out there, the cost of training, which is the convincing part of the cybersecurity protection paradigm, is expected to far outstrip the losses from cyber attacks and the cost of containment and constrainment, right? So this is a RAND estimate, and these costs of training are expected to go up significantly, and they're already going up, right? So the user protection paradigm is very important to understand, because that's where the real cost today is. That's where there's a lot of activity, and that's where there's a lot of man hours and human hours being put in. So what is this framework, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the user protection framework and where this comes from. Like, what are we doing right now to protect people from social engineering, right? And the primary framework that you can use to understand how our organizations in the United States and now the world over are approaching user risk comes from the NIST cybersecurity framework. And what the NIST cybersecurity framework does is it provides a user risk management blueprint. And this is a blueprint that is widely adopted, right? You have universities, the federal government has applied this framework. Universities like Chicago, Pittsburgh have applied this. Companies like, multi-billion-dollar companies like Intel has applied this framework. So this risk management framework is a blueprint that people use. And I know companies in the EU that also, and in Singapore, have also applied this framework to kind of deal with user risk in the enterprise. And so a quick snapshot of this framework basically helps you organize risk, right? And understand risk. And there is basically 4 tiers across which the organization evolves. And so in the first tier, you have very little risk understanding. By tier 4, the company has become, or the organization's users have become very adaptive to social engineering risk. So NIST provides a kind of a process flow by which a corporate can go from a tier 1, where you're very partially informed about social engineering risk, to tier 2, where you're more risk informed, to tier 3, where you're now becoming more dynamic and you're doing it repeatedly, and tier 4, where you can become very adaptive. Okay, and companies the world over have applied this, and I don't expect you to read this entire chart, but this is a layout of how Intel, a multi-billion-dollar company, as we all know, applies this tier 1 to tier 4 framework to deal with its people risk, which is social engineering risk. And this page is available online. It's also in my book. But when you look at this, all you need to do is look at a few keywords, and what you realize is essentially every tier and the process of going from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 to tier 4 happens through training. Okay, and it happens through some form of training. In fact, the word security awareness training, which is the primary form of training, appears over here like 15 plus times. So you go from tier 1, where you don't have training, to tier 2, where you have staff training pipeline, to tier 3, where you have some kind of trainings and briefings and more training opportunities in a pipeline, and tier 4, where you have more training. So essentially, if you want to encapsulate what it means to go from NIST tier 1 to NIST tier 4, it's basically train, some more training, and then a lot more training. Of course, there are different forms of training that do this. But more importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about those forms of training, and also what are the metrics that people use in this particular tier 1 to tier 4 adaptive transformation. The primary metric of user cyber risk is either the completion of phishing awareness training, that is, did you complete or pass some kind of awareness briefing or training or certification? And the second is a pass-fail metric. So you do a pen test, and all of us here know how a pen test is done. You send a mock phishing email, and you check to see if people passed or failed. The more people who fail the test, the more the cyber risk. So these are your 2 metrics that allow you to basically understand risk, capture risk in the NIST cybersecurity framework, and basically 2 types of training are used to basically go from tier 1 all the way to tier 4. Okay? And so how are these metrics derived? In the course of my career, I have worked with corporations in different parts of the world and actually replicated and been part of their training exercises. So I've seen how they do it. I've done this on an academic setting, so I've done this using better measurement and so on. And so there are two basic forms of training that are used to go from tier 1 all the way to tier 4. One form of training is your briefing type of training. I call that didactic training, didactic being sort of some kind of a classroom-oriented training that allows you to go from, let's say, partially risk-informed to tier 2, risk-informed, right? So this is considered a low-level training that gives you the certifications and all of those things that are necessary, but they're not considered the gold standard. And I have, done this training in different corporations to see, okay, how well does all this work? Here's an example of something that I was a part of where I did this in a large financial organization. We trained half the people because, of course, it was an experimental piece for us. There were about 500 employees. And basically, we did some off-the-shelf training. We had a corporation come in, do their training. Then we had repeated training. The data is available if you need it. And then we fished them over 3 non-consecutive days. And what we found was that didactic training was useless, right? Regardless of how you looked at it, whether you got trained or whether you didn't get trained, just as many people, got fished, right? So the training really didn't matter. The phishing success rates remained the same. So we understand that the certification approach is a rather weak approach, and I think NIST concurs with us in that. So then we said, okay, what's the second form of training? This is the embedded risk training. This is considered the gold standard. Didactic training takes you to tier 2. Embedded training makes you that tier 4 highly adaptive. This is like the gold standard. You've achieved, training nirvana. You've achieved complete phishing resilience, depending on how your numbers look. And so that's called embedded training. This is where all the vendor market is today. Big names, almost $1 billion companies out there do embedded training, which is basically phishing pen testing. You send people a phish. Embedded in it is some kind of training. So when you click on it, you fall for it. I can tell you, hey, here's why you fell for it. And the idea is if you do this repeatedly, often enough, eventually someone like me will figure it out. And if I don't figure it out, then you can always force me to, go back to didactic training, or you can shame me or, yell at me a bit. And all of this happens in corporations out there. So I was lucky enough to work with a federal government agency to basically look at their training and to evaluate it. So just to give you an overview of how this company worked, this had about 600 employees. It was based in the United States, and they had already done 2 years of embedded training. So for 2 years, this particular corporation had done phishing tests using this embedded training framework. They had used a very popular phishing simulation product, a vendor. They had a vendor sitting in the company who was doing the test, and then there was a vendor who had provided the test. So there was, all the layers of government and vendors that you could think of. Keep in mind, this is the gold standard, and I love these kind of CISOs. The security officer, the person heading this, he was he loved to train people. He had a military background and a naval submarine background where you train. And so he trained. And his data that he presented to me when I started this conversation was phenomenal, right? He went from 11.28%, phishing click-through. This is the 11% of the people fell for a phish on year 1 when they started this, all the way to less than about 1% by the end of it in Q4 of 2017. And so the reason he approached me was because he wanted to bring this one to zero. He said, I got about 1-2%, sometimes less than 1%. How do I bring them down to zero? And he had watched my talk on Black Hat and read a paper of mine. And he said, you talk about bringing this down. I would love to give you an opportunity to bring this down to zero. So that was my mandate. And so this is embedded training. And if you look at the cybersecurity standards, this is a tier 4, right? You have achieved adaptiveness because you've gone from having nothing to a training pipeline to now having embedded training all the time. So you've become a dynamic tier 4 low risk corporation. But so when I started this, my only request from this corporation was that rather than using a vendor and doing all these things, I would create a phishing test. That is, I would create the phishing email that went out to his staff. And so he agreed to that, and I sent that phishing email out. It was, phishing email that was sent out, nothing dramatic, just a phishing email. And I got a call at 9:30 that morning, Eastern time, saying, holy shit, I don't know what you did, but a lot of people are calling us. They're all falling for the phish. All right. We got a 14% success rate after 36 attempts prior, with numbers that were less than 1% by the time they got it. In fact, we had 5 individuals who fell victim to attacks repeatedly. Okay? And basically, we sent the same email, the same phishing email, on 2 consecutive days or non-consecutive days. Okay, so we got a 15% click-through here. So suddenly, even the data that this individual had, this company had, going back to year 1, which was around 10%, looked better than what we were getting. So the question here is, what was going on? So what's going on? And this is what's going on out there in industry, in corporations the world over, right? We have the gold standard is embedded phishing or doing some kind of didactic phishing. Not to mention, we've been doing, in the United States at least, since 2004, cybersecurity awareness months. We have a month-long cybersecurity awareness month event where the primary focus is on social engineering. None of this has really made the difference when you start looking at the data up close, right? I mean, from far, a lot of these things appear to work. But when you really sit down and start looking at it, you start seeing that there are huge limitations to the current paradigm. What are these limitations? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the limitations of how we've been approaching awareness and what's going on before I tell you a little bit about how we do it differently. So one of the first problems we have is there is no standard for awareness today. What does this mean? It means we don't know what security awareness means. We don't know when security awareness has been achieved. So is it enough to know that there is something called Nigerian phishing email? Is that awareness enough? And I'm not even splitting the differences between, let's say, awareness and knowledge, and we can talk about that as academics. But what do we mean by security awareness? What does it mean? I've given talks in various parts of the world, in far corners of the world, and everybody by now has gotten some phishing email and is aware of it. I mean, the word phishing now is well known the world over. So awareness, what does it mean? And what does knowledge mean? If we think security awareness is knowledge, what is this level of knowledge? What is that standard? And there really is no clarity on it. So is Security Awareness Month equal to security awareness? Is security knowledge equal to security awareness? And if we say security knowledge, how do we measure security knowledge? I mean, what do we want someone to know? Do we want someone to know, how to look at the header of an email? Do we want them to say, okay, do you need to know how to look at the originating IP? Do you want them to take another further step to understand how to track that IP to see if it is who they claim to be? People should understand what a TLS certificate is. What do we mean by awareness and knowledge? It's completely unclear at this point. But what we do see is whenever we look at knowledge itself, does knowledge even matter? So in the attacks I have done, what we notice is that regardless of what training they do, knowledge effects are minimal or negligible. So people get phished regardless of knowledge. So if knowledge is what phishing awareness should be, that's what we mean, then what amount of knowledge, and then what is the validity of that knowledge? Is knowledge a valid causal restriction to getting deceived? We don't have an answer to that. So that's your first problem. We don't even know what we are trying to achieve. So it's hard to achieve something if you don't know where the marathon ends. But it's fun because, and we'll talk about why that is important, but the second issue we have is we have no standard for a test. We don't have any standard for a pen test. There's no corporation or organization out there that has an idea of what it means to do in what is an ideal pen test. So I have asked this question, and I implore you to go and ask this to any CISO you meet, any IT person who does pen testing. And you say, what is a pen test? Like, what's a good pen test? One answer I often get is, it is what the security guys think is fun, right? Oh, we find it really hilarious when people fall for this. This is the condescending IT perspective, which is, I know what could trick you, so I'm going to do this. And that's one answer I've got. A second answer, it's designed in an adversarial manner. I mean, this is basically saying, we have an IT department that sees itself as kind of like the gatekeepers of the organization, and we want to show that, you guys can be vulnerable. That's the second answer I've got. The third answer I've got, it's a test that nets you a 10% click-through. If you looked at that slide from when I showed you about this federal government agency, you'll notice in Q1, the first attack netted about 11 to 12% success rate in the embedded test. That's a number that many vendors suggest. They say, well, what is a good test? A good test would be one that gets you about a 10% click-through. Go one layer below and say, why should it get you a 10% click-through? There really is no answer for it. They'll tell you, that's what we see across the industry. Which industry? We see across the entire world. Where are they getting this data from? There is absolutely no standard for it. And having a numerical standard of 10% doesn't mean anything. The fourth answer we usually see is it's a test that's now being flagged by the FBI or some ISAC, or somebody told us that it happened. You see a lot of vendors doing this too, which is they'll create pen tests based on attacks that they have seen out there. Well, the problem with that is this is the very definition of being reactive. When we want people to be adaptive and proactive, showing them something that's already happened is basically teaching them about something that happened yesterday. It's like fighting the last war. So yeah, there is some value to teaching people about the attacks they haven't seen, but if you have already seen it or if it's already happened, it's likely that it may not be used again. So it's not really making you a tier 4 adaptive individual or corporation, it's preparing you for the last war. And so there are other questions which I've asked, right? When is a test too hard? If I hack into, let's say, Matt's email and send every one of us in this forum an email claiming to be Matt, is that a test that's too easy or too hard or impossible for anyone to spot? Is it even a test anymore? Is that a pen test? Is it too easy? So I've seen tests that are so easy that everybody passes it because, of course, people who read it can see when something doesn't make any sense. Or a test is too hard, where it's impossible to detect. Now, mind you, if you looked at those 2 data points I talked about, one of it for cyber risk, one of those data points is pen test failure rates. And you can game that failure rate very easily if you create tests that are very easy or very hard. You can manipulate those numbers very easily. Not to forget, there is another factor that most of these pen tests don't measure, which is pen test guessing. I've seen in corporations that I work in, that I've consulted for, people guessing. People become very good at guessing. Humans are very adaptive. They know when it's a test. It's almost, they're very good at guessing. In fact, people tell them there's a test coming, especially in organizations where the supervisor is going to get punitive treatments because of the way in which his group functions. He or she is going to tell everyone, and they do. So that's your second limitation. We don't know what a good pen test is. The third limitation, there's a ceiling effect. No matter what you do, every program done right fails someone. Someone always slips through. And there is a ceiling effect that no one can explain. It's the reason this federal government agency came to me. The fourth is no one knows why. No one knows why someone falls for it. I get emails like this from people all over the world. Things like, we've had a program for 3.5 years, and this is a director of IT security at a pretty large national bank. He said, we've had a program for 3.5 years. I know it's not age, gender, position, longevity, role or eye color. I don't know what it is. And this is a problem. No methodology that exists, at least until now, explains why people are falling or why they are not. The fifth problem, and this is something when I teach my students, I talk about this a lot, which is, this is the formula out there is when you have bullshit metrics and fancy terms and charts, what you get is bullshit results that you can present with high confidence. And this happens a lot. I'm going to show you a chart. You don't have to read this, but this is a fancy chart. It's called a security awareness maturity model indicators matrix. It's a mouthful, but it's a fancy chart. It's a beautiful chart. Lots of fancy things, but essentially it teaches companies, and this is actually something I got from LinkedIn a couple of months ago, late last year. And it tells you how a company can go from stage 1 of your NIST cybersecurity framework, the all familiar framework that I talked about earlier, to stage 4. And it has a massive metrics framework. So what are these metrics? Because of course, no one sits down and reads it because it's a fancy chart with lots of interesting words written in fine print. So I'm going to go through some of these metrics. So here are your metrics. To go to stage 2, measure the number of people who complete training, and on it goes. Number of on-site training sessions, number of people that have signed an acceptable use policy. Here are some other metrics. Phishing simulation click-through rates. Again, things we've talked about and things that make no sense. Number of infected computers and devices each month. Infected by what? Number of stolen computer devices each month. Okay? How about stage 4? Survey people's attitudes towards information security. Look at the number of people requesting briefing. How about number of requests on how family can take training? Sure, some of these are related to phishing or social engineering, but how many of these are valid indicators of an individual's susceptibility to social engineering? There were others that were removed, which were in the last iteration of this, number of mobile devices with passcodes, and counting the number of sensitive documents in dumpsters. So sure, you can go look through your dumpsters in your organization and look and see how many sensitive documents are there. Is that an indicator of some level of risk? Perhaps. But for the most part, these things are either invariant, for instance, number of mobile devices with passcodes, or the number of people that have signed an acceptable use policy. Well, you got to sign it once, so they're invariant. Some of these are totally invalid. Number of stolen computer devices each month. What is the validity of that from an individual risk, unless this person is individually constantly losing their computers? And some of them are irrelevant. Dumpster diving? Sure. How relevant is it? Number of people attending optional events? How relevant is it? The problem is we have these kind of metrics that are out there that are being used by people because it comes with fancy charts, big names, a lot of credibility. So we have a problem with metrics. And the final problem, the final limitation, is that awareness training today isn't a solution. It appears, or it's presented as a solution, but really it's a product. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. If you go online in the United States, there's a ton of money being poured to lobby Congress. All of this data is available to basically make sure that security awareness is mandated. And there's no wonder that security awareness and the training costs are going up. But there's a price that we all pay. A lot of people change their behaviors because of it. In surveys I have done, fear of being caught impacts general email use. There's a lot of change in how people work, in how people behave, in how people act, based on what they are being put to, and the man hours wasted, the efficiency loss of constantly doing this, knowing fully well that much of this data is virtually worthless. So what I've tried to do through my work is change the security paradigm. And how do we change the security paradigm? We change the security paradigm by trying to, fill those gaps that are there by diagnosing the reasons for risk, right? And using a scientific approach for doing this. So how is this approach done, right? First, looking at all those limitations I talked about, first, your pen testing environment must be valid. Because any pen test, or for that matter, any testing environment for any risk model is as good as its inputs. If your inputs are bad, if your pen tests are all over the place, it doesn't matter what data you get out of it, that data is still going to be of questionable validity or questionable reliability. The second issue is we need to measure the symptoms. The assumption of a lot of training is that training matters, or that some level of Q-based education matters, or that some kind of certification matters, or that lost or stolen devices matter. We have to know what these are. We can't just measure it for the sake of measuring it. We need to measure the symptoms that are the most valid symptoms. For that, you need an appropriate diagnostic. You need a diagnostic that can tell you how people fall for social engineering or deception and why they fall for it. And the fourth is, and this is an important point I talk about quite a bit, which is you need a diagnostic that is not just limited to one operating system or one technology or one attack. Too often we see this where you have a lot of these attacks that go across devices, but we train people to use one operating system or one kind of document or one kind of email app or one kind of system. So we need something that can kind of evolve with technology. And the way to do that is to not focus on technology, but to focus on the user. And we need a quantitative, scalable, reliable benchmark. So these are all the things that we try to develop and that I've developed that's part of the book, The Weakest Link. But in a sense, there are two parts to what the research that I've done over the years leads to. The first is we need to begin by understanding how you craft an appropriate pen test. For that, you got to understand what's in a phishing attack. How do you understand a phishing email attack? Now, all of us in this group knows what phishing is. And I don't want to talk about the details of how phishing occurs or what phishing is, but when you look at an attack, how do you tell somebody in IT to understand this attack? Like, what are you going to ask them to focus? So here's an email I got last week, January 26th, so a couple of days ago. It was a PDF document. It came to my email account from Geek Squad, claiming to be from Geek Squad, and it came from my Gmail account. And it was not, for whatever reason, my email let that through because it was from Gmail. It's a Geek Squad invoice, supposedly. I don't use Geek Squad. I knew this was a phishing email, but I flagged it. I was like, okay, I'm going to use this. So how do we take this email and, if we were to develop a pen test, how do we categorize this? How do we understand this? So the first part of my research program we used an approach to do this. So we looked to see what people were doing. So I was trying to say, okay, what are people doing? So here's an example of how some of this classification works. Adam Engst has got a field guide to identifying phishing. Now, this is a explanation of how phishing emails are categorized in general. So what he does is he takes all the emails that he receives, and you can look this up. This is online. He's done a great job doing this. But what he does is he looks at some structural features of the email and comes up with a categorization. So this is a categorization schema that says, okay, this is a password reset email. It's got the word password reset. It's asking you to reconfirm password, and on it goes. Or another way to classify it, here's a voice note notification email. Or here's another email, a Norton 360 invoice email. So if you follow that categorization schema, what you end up with, well, this is a Geek Squad invoice email. The problem with doing this is that you can keep doing this for every brand out there. You can have a Best Buy. You can have something that's from Norway. You can have something that's from Sweden. You'd have to go and keep doing this exercise over and over and over again for every brand, and then for different invoices, and then for different attack vectors. But it doesn't really help you say, okay, how do I create an attack? What is a good attack? So, for instance, here's an attack that's pretty hard to qualify. A couple of years ago, in 2015, my data was breached in a Blue Cross, which is an American insurer, attack, and I received a letter from Anthem stating that I was getting my data had been disclosed in a cyber attack. Now, I received a physical letter, as many of us here probably in this forum also did, on November 4th of 2015. However, months before that, in February, I received this email also from Anthem, claiming to be from Anthem, giving me free credit protection. And the question here is, how do we qualify this attack? There are attacks that are done which have a timing to them, they have a sequence to them, they have features in them, they have factors in them, which all go together to create a good attack. So to understand this, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what makes a good attack. So we came up with an inductive approach where we used data from numerous attacks that are out there, and where we had the victimization rates through different pen tests given to us by 5 or 10 different corporations. So we have about tens of thousands of actual attack reactions. And we came up with a classification mechanism, and the data and the paper for this is available. I presented this even at Black Hat in 2016, 17, and 18. So this is online on YouTube as well. And so what we found is that most attacks, in fact, every attack can be classified based on essentially 3 major factors of this triad. The first is, does the attack come from a trusted source? So there are various things in an email that can cue you to think about a trusted source. So you'd have like Google, for instance. This is an attack that claims to be from Google, which is a trusted source. Usually these are what are called as credibility cues that are in an email that allow you to say, okay, you know what, do I trust this attack? The second is, are there modifiable fields? So modifiable fields are very important because in our mind, we are used to certain fields being modified and not looking complete. So this is a second part of it. So sometimes when we see things being modified, we discount it. We become a little bit more cavalier. A great example of this is when you share documents in the cloud. Google Documents is a big problem with this. If I share a file to you or any of you, and Matt just shared something to me, what you notice is the file that comes to me will come from an email account that's not an email account that's listed or that I will recognize. So I tend to discount that in my mind. And people do this all the time with a lot of different things online. And because of this, if you have certain fields that get modified, even though that could be modified by a bad guy, she or he can get away with it. And the third vortex we found was matching user routines or expectations. So these 3 vertices trigger different kinds of heuristics, right? So you have credibility heuristics that signal trust. You have customizability, which is modifiable fields and capabilities. And then we have compatibility, which is matching user routines. And we derived this inductively. So we came up with a ton of data from different attacks to look and develop this triad. And when you look at any good phishing email, you will notice that these elements exist in good attacks. So for instance, here's a non-scientific phishing test that was sent by Gizmodo, the publisher online, to 15 Trump administration officials. And if you notice over here, you will see it's got every part of that attack from the v-triad in it. It's got modifiable fields, which people discount. You have a trusted source, Google Documents, and then you have compatibility. This went to people in the White House. And so, people like the FBI Director Comey responded to this email. Because, of course, it's coming in turn. It's very, very compatible with the way in which they worked. This is important because it allows us to classify attacks based on the user rather than classify them based on the attacker. So it's rather than saying, here's the intent of the attack, or here's what this attack is looking like. It's asking you to enter a credential. This classifies it based on how the user interprets it and how it fits within their cognitive framework. And so you can take an attack that's not a good attack and you can see the differences in it. You can suddenly say, here's an attack that's not compatible with the way in which I work. It comes from an email account that I don't recognize, and it's got everything that's missing in it. It doesn't have any credibility heuristics. So if you look at the success rate of this attack, it's less than 0.0001%. Okay? This is important. And the reason the v-triad is important is because the first step to designing an ideal test environment is to make sure that your test picks each of these vertices and understands and develops a pen test that's appropriate by using parts of each of these vertex to develop what is called as an ideal test. The second part of this is the flip side to the weakest link in how we understand user base is to understand the people. And this is a part that has been missing and that I've contributed to the literature quite a bit, which is why do people, the answering the why question on why do people fall for phishing. So before I start talking about this, some of us in the United States, if we were, around last year, you couldn't have missed this story. There was a story of an inmate who escaped from a prison in Alabama, and he fell in love with a corrections officer who helped him escape. The two of them ran for about 11 days. They were caught 3 states away. Okay, and they were caught in Indiana. They escaped from Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. And the story of how they were caught is a pretty interesting story, right? And what happened over here was someone who worked at a car wash basically saw a vehicle, a pickup truck with local Indiana plates, sticking out of one of the car wash bays, parked over there, over a couple of days. And he, for whatever reason, thought something was off. And he went and checked the car. He saw the keys in the car, in the truck. Then he called the cops, and the cops said, it's nothing. But he then insisted that maybe it's something. Now, mind you, this is 3 states away. There was absolutely nothing that said this was anything other than maybe somebody's truck that had been left there. And the truck was moving. The guy would come and take it and come back. But for whatever reason, this guy insisted. And eventually, the cops came and checked the car. It wasn't stolen. It was not stolen. So it was not a stolen truck. But something set this person off. And what that thing is called suspicion. Something made him suspicious, and he insisted on it. He kept checking it. And then eventually, it was so that he alerted the authorities. They came in on a Monday, like 5 days later, and they were like, holy cow, this is that guy. And that's what resulted in these 2 people being caught. And this is a story that plays out often. In Buffalo, New York, where I am, last year, a JetBlue pilot passed through TSA, went and sat in the plane, was doing his pre-flight checks and all that stuff. The TSA agent felt something was off. He suspected something was off, and he came back. TSA agents, you'll seldom see them do this. He came back, got onto the plane, talked to the pilot one more time, and gave him a breathalyzer. And the guy was way impaired to be flying a plane. This thing that we seldom focus on is a feeling, a sense that each and every one of us has experienced, and that's called suspicion. Suspicion is one of these things that's been least studied out there. Most of the studies on suspicion tends not to basically focus on suspicion from a cyber deception point of view. But suspicion is a very important factor. So, when I teach a class, I ask students, point to me where a suspicion is in you, right? When you felt that thing called suspicion, when you suspected something. It's like happiness. When you have that sense of happiness, if you ask you to point to it, it sounds very gestalt in the sense that people can't point out where suspicion is. But suspicion is there, is that trigger. There's that sense that something is off. And usually it is a reaction to information cues or some cues in the environment. But what it also does, very importantly, is it triggers a nonlinear response. What it does is when you start suspecting, your heightened sense of information processing goes up. As cognitive scientists, we look at this and say, wow, here's something that now floods your interpretive involvement. And then now you have a nonlinear response, and you start actually paying attention to data that you may not have paid attention to earlier. And it's very similar to the intensity of coughing, right? Like we have, when we look at coughing as a marker for, let's say, a cold, or sneezing as a marker, the depth and intensity of coughing as a marker for, say, human illness, suspicion can serve as a very effective marker for your likelihood to detect deception or to get deceived, right? And doesn't mean just because you're suspicious, you're going to be able to do it. Suspicion requires certain other factors, and we're going to talk a little bit about those factors, because its causes are multidimensional. So they exist in a 2, 3, 4-dimensional space, and that's not Gestalt. You can measure that. We can measure what it is that causes suspicion and what it is that causes that suspicion to lead to deception detection. So a lot of my work has looked at exactly that and tried and come up with measures for suspicion and for those multidimensional triggers of suspicion. And I'm going to talk just broadly and briefly about those. The first thing that I've looked at, one of those important markers, is cognition, right? How do users think? How do people think? And most of us as cognitive scientists see this. I've done these kind of studies where I've compared. This is very early on, where I looked at in a factorial study, we looked at different Facebook pages. We created fake Facebook login pages, and it's a very interesting exercise. And every one of you probably noticed this, where there's a missing O in this Facebook here, and the top 2 Facebook pages have the right colors, and the bottom 2 have the wrong colors. And it's an experiment that tells you, what are the kind of heuristics people use. And what's really interesting in this particular study is that people do use a lot of heuristics. So when the color is right, when the look is right, the 2 Facebook pages up top, the blue ones, tend to get a lot of people deceived. And the most important part of this study is something that people seldom recognize. It is that even the people who do fall for, let's say, the second Facebook page, the third Facebook page, or the fourth Facebook page, seldom realize this, that there are a lot of people who fall for this first Facebook page, and the first Facebook page itself was a fake. So in other words, no matter what you did in this, if you used a heuristic, you fell for it. So heuristics matter, right? Here's an example of a great web spoof that we did. We did this for Wi-Fi connections in the United States at Starbucks a couple of years ago. You used to get free Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was provided by Google. Most people knew this. So, you would accept and connect. It was Google's fiber, Wi-Fi, what have you, that used to do it. So we created a login page to their Google email account. Of course, we didn't collect passwords, but there were tens of thousands of people who just willingly gave it to us. Because, of course, when you're using a heuristic and you're automated and used to that use of that heuristic, you're going to do this. Heuristics matter. What kind of heuristics people use, we have a pretty broad understanding of it, and we have specific measures for different types of heuristics that matter in online environments. So we know those heuristics, and we can measure those. And those are important because if you have the right heuristics, you could fall, it reduces the level of suspicion that you have. And so you get deceived. Another very important contribution that we made, and another very interesting finding, is cognition. This is something that is not very well understood. And this is, what do users believe? Earlier, before we started this conversation today, I was talking to Matt and Torvald about this. One of the interesting things about the internet is back in 10, 15, my dissertation 20 years ago, we were looking at cultural differences in technology use. But when you look at the internet today, a lot of using and experiences of how you use the internet has gotten unified. Almost all of us use one of 2 or 3 operating systems, one of 2 or 3 or 4 different browsers. Even the online corporations that platforms or apps that we use are pretty much unified. Facebook is Facebook. Maybe the language changes, but it's still Facebook. Same goes for Twitter. And you can keep extending this example to Netflix and so on and so forth. And what you realize is a lot of this unification also means that studying risk and understanding user cognition is very important because it now applies all over the world. It's not just risk in the United States being very different from risk in, let's say, Japan. Risk is risk because the user's experiences at the interface levels are essentially unified. An important part of understanding that risk is understanding what users believe. How do we form our understanding of how to use technology? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I remember Windows 1995. You used to buy a book with it. There used to be a Windows 1995 how to use book. Today, nothing comes with a book. I mean, you can buy an electric car and you just figure it out. A lot of things are figure it out. And in the figure it out world, people form beliefs without really any playbook on how to use something. And we learn about it either by doing, we learn about it by extending our understanding from other areas of our life or other experiences that are online that are analogous to it. Sometimes this analogous nature of those are deliberately put in, like for instance, email or books online are made to, skeuomorphically look like real world books because they want you to think about it in similar terms. So we extend ideas, we form beliefs about things online based on basically very scant knowledge. And many of these things are usually flawed in how we think about it. So the sad part, or the sad reality of this, is most of us don't understand the extent of what we don't know. And that's one of the problems which my work on what I call cyber risk beliefs works on, which is, there's Confucius, I believe, who said this, real knowledge is knowing the extent of one's ignorance. That is, to know what you don't know is really important. But when you go around looking at attitudes of people, efficacy of people, perceptions of how well they understand technology, most people, including every one of us, we believe we understand how email works, for instance, or how a document type works, or how secure it is, and so on and so forth. So we have a what is called as a cyber risk belief measure, which addresses this and tries to measure what beliefs people hold and the beliefs that matter that make you a little bit more cavalier than others when it comes to online use. A simple example is a survey that I've done the world over, where I ask people, what is safer to open, a PDF document or a Word document? And you'd be surprised the number of people who say PDFs. And they are wrong because and if you ask them why, they're neither right or wrong, but if you ask them, okay, why is a PDF document more safer than a Word document? It's because they would say, well, I can't edit it, right? So they're wrong in the way they're forming this belief. The right answer to this is both of them are equally unsafe. But this is a reason why when you looked at that email that I got from Geekbench or Geek Squad earlier, it was a PDF document. There are many such things that we have measured, including things like, is a webmail more secure? Is SMS more secure? And so on and so forth. I have an entire cyber risk beliefs quiz for anybody who's interested in looking at it. I'll post this link in the notes on YouTube later. Take a look at it. And what these risk beliefs tell us, though, is how people look at things online and how confident they are in overlooking certain things. And so what we find is people with low risk beliefs tend to be more confident in doing things online because they don't know what they don't know, but they're very confident in what they don't know without even realizing they don't know. So this classic paradox of words that I just used is your Dunning-Kruger effect, where you have people who have low knowledge claiming to have or having very high confidence in using that. And a lot of us suffer from that. And the internet is rife with that because of just the nature in which programming works, what I talked about earlier about skeuomorphism and all that stuff. And then the final factor that's an important aspect that we've contributed is the idea of habits. This is something that most people were overlooking. I did some of the very early work on habits from a cyber deception point of view, and habits matter a lot, right? We check email ritualistically, we text, we walk, drive, so on and so forth. All of these habits, we have simulated them and we have done experimental studies where we find that people with strong habits, it's highly moderated by device. So mobile devices, tablets, constrained environments, constrained cognitive processing abilities because of being in certain environments increases habitual reactions and increases the likelihood of getting compromised or not noticing the deception. In other words, it reduces your ability to detect deception. It's the good old distracted duckling scam. So all in all, this brings us to the overall model that we use, right? See, the overall model that we use is a model that tells us the level of whether suspicion was triggered, the extent to which it was triggered, the influences of the information environment on that triggering, and the impact of various devices on it. Of course, this doesn't suffice. You also need to have knowledge. So in other words, if you have good knowledge, then suspicion can lead to deception detection in most cases, which is where focus processing comes in. So focus processing alone doesn't matter, but focus processing in addition to sound knowledge where after suspicion is triggered is going to lead to deception detection. So this, in a sense, is the overall model that we have, and this is a measurement model. So in other words, we have measures for pretty much every one of these factors. And what we do is we leverage this understanding And how do we leverage this? We leverage this to diagnose cyber risk. And how do we do it? Number one, we have a mechanism, a methodology to convert some of the measurement that we have in the suspicion, cognition, and automaticity factors into a score of cyber risk. This cyber risk score is a reaction to a test that is developed using the triad. So the testing environment is actually controlled because it's not just any test, it's a test that has been benchmarked against something that is developed within the triad, and it's empirically benchmarked. What does that mean? That means that we know exactly what that triad developed test will lead to in terms of a score. So we know, think about like a blood pressure monitor. We know the ideal numbers there, and those ideal numbers are not just randomly picked as 10%. Those ideal numbers are picked from a benchmark study that's been done earlier using those same indices or same vectoral factors to develop a test. Okay, and then these are then used within a pen testing environment. So if you have an existing, let's say a corporation has an existing red teaming, pen testing product with $1 billion vendor products out there, you can essentially use this pen test there and use our survey as a diagnosis in the end. And once you do that, you have data that can be aggregated. You can have aggregations across divisions, organizations, sectors, so on and so forth. What we've been able to do with this is we have an empirical tipping point to the index. So we can tell you at what point risk at the user level is now so high or so low, so high that now this individual or individuals are the weakest links in enterprise security. And more importantly, we can tell you why, right? So we can tell you, okay, here's why these people are high risk. Here's why these people are low risk. So once you can do this, and you can say, here are the risks coming from. The risks are coming from habits. The risks are coming from patterns. The risks are coming, let's say, from heuristics. We can do this at the individual level. We can do it at the aggregate, like division level. So we can say, here are all the people from these particular roles, and here are the kind of heuristics they're using. Here's what we need to do to fix that. So now, rather than using a one-size-fits-all training approach, we can have a training approach that is much more focused on just fixing that problem for those individuals. And so there are many advantages to doing this, right? First, it's a quantitative diagnostic. This helps you now do everything that we haven't been able to do, which is track improvements using a standard baseline. We have a diagnosis. And most importantly, we're focusing not on a technology, not on a device, not on a operating system, but we're using users as the point of contact for this, right? And so this is scalable across divisions, organizations, sectors, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what's the weakest link about, which is how do we diagnose, how do we detect, how do we defend, and why we are doing it the way we're doing it. All right, so I'm going to stop at this and turn it over to you, Matt.